December 1944. 11,000 American soldiers are surrounded at Bastogne, cut off on all sides, running out of ammunition, running out of time. Allied planners looked at the roads. Locked in ice, they looked at the weather. Grounding every aircraft that might help, they looked at the distances, the forces available, the conditions on the ground. Their conclusion: a meaningful relief force cannot reach Bastogne in under several weeks. Several weeks Bastogne did not have. General George S. Patton told Eisenhower he could launch a relief attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room at Verdun went quiet. What Patton had already done, way before that meeting even started, is what makes this story worth understanding. This is how it actually happened. By December 1944, Germany's position in the West was falling apart. Allied armies had swept through France and were pushing hard toward the German border. Fuel was scarce. Fresh soldiers were barely arriving, and the men at the top of the German command knew the numbers no longer worked in their favor. But Adolf Hitler had one card left: a counteroffensive through the Ardennes. The Ardennes, a dense, hilly stretch of forest running across Belgium and Luxembourg, had been the root of Germany's stunning breakthrough in 1940. Hitler believed it could work a second time. The plan, formally called Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine, called for 3 German armies to punch through thinly held American lines, cross the Meuse River, and drive northwest to take the port of Antwerp. Antwerp was the main supply lifeline for the entire Allied Northern Front. Lose it, and Allied operations in the north would collapse. It would split the British from the Americans. It might force a negotiated peace. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding German forces in the West, was widely reported to have had serious doubts from the start, privately believing the objectives were far beyond what Germany's remaining strength could realistically pull off. But the plan went ahead. In the early hours of December 16, 1944, under heavy cloud cover that kept Allied reconnaissance aircraft on the ground, 3 German armies hit the American the 8th Corps across an 80-mile front. The shock was real and it was severe. American units, some of them new to combat, some spread thin across quiet sectors they'd been sent to for rest, were overwhelmed in the opening hours. Communications broke down. The scale of the attack was far bigger than Allied intelligence had seen coming. Within 24 hours, a deep bulge had been torn into the Allied line, and right at the center of it, sitting across 7 converging roads, suddenly worth more than almost any other piece of ground in the region, was Bastogne. Bastogne was a quiet market town of maybe 4,000 people, tucked into the hills of the Belgian Ardennes. No particular fame, no strategic history worth mentioning. What it had was roads. 7 major roads came together at Bastogne. In the Ardennes, in winter, with frozen ground and thick forest cutting off almost every other option for moving armor, those 7 roads were everything. Hold Bastogne and you controlled movement. Lose it and your armored columns would be squeezed onto secondary tracks through frozen forest, grinding to a halt. German commanders grasped this from day one. On December 17th, elements of the German 5th Panzer Army started pushing hard for Bastogne. American forces were moving in from the other direction. Combat commands of the 10th Armored Division and other scattered units racing in to buy time. Then, through the night of December 18th and into the 19th, the 101st Airborne Division arrived. The 101st had been pulled from a rest area at Reims, France, still recovering from the brutal fighting in Holland during Operation Market Garden. They had no proper winter gear. Some men showed up in summer uniforms. Ammunition was already tight, but they came into Bastogne and they got ready to hold. By December 21st, the ring was shut. Every road in and out of Bastogne was cut. The town and the men defending it, roughly 11,000 American soldiers in total, were completely surrounded, with no way to get supplies in by ground, and an overcast sky that was keeping Allied transport aircraft from getting through. Inside the perimeter, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe set his forces along a defensive line. Ammunition went on strict ration immediately. Artillery shells were counted and carefully assigned. Medical supplies were dangerously low. Doctors worked in makeshift conditions. Men sheltered in cellars and frozen foxholes, holding their ground against a force that had them badly outnumbered. Every day that passed meant fewer shells, fewer supplies, more men down. On December 22nd, a German officer came forward under a white flag carrying a formal written demand for surrender. The message made clear that if the Americans kept fighting, their annihilation would follow. McAuliffe's written reply was a single word: nuts. The defense went on, but a perimeter only holds as long as the men inside have the means to hold it. And those means were running down day by day, hour by hour. Help from outside was the only way out, and by every serious military estimate at Allied headquarters, that help was weeks away. On December 19th, 3 days into the German offensive, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower called an emergency conference at Verdun, France. The atmosphere, by all accounts, was tense. Bastogne was surrounded or very close to it. German armor was pushing deep, threatening to split the Allied front clean in two. Decisions couldn't wait. The central question was simple, and it was brutal. Could a serious counterattack be launched from the south, in time to get through to Bastogne before the men defending it were overwhelmed? The planning staff leaned toward caution, and they had good reason to. Moving a force big enough to punch through German lines, pulling it out of its current positions, rerouting its supply chain, turning it 90 degrees from where it was currently headed and driving it north through winter terrain, was a massive undertaking. Standard military planning put that kind of move at a minimum of several weeks, even when conditions were reasonable. The conditions here were anything but reasonable. Then Eisenhower turned to Patton. Patton said he could attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The reaction, by multiple accounts, ranged from doubt to flat disbelief. Eisenhower pushed back directly. This wasn't the time for big talk. 48 hours on a completely new direction of advance through ice and snow with enough force to break through German lines? That wasn't what any planning framework in the room said was achievable. Patton wasn't making a bold claim. He was telling them what was already happening. The reason Patton could walk into Verdun and say what he said had nothing to do with improvisation. It had everything to do with work that had already been done. Days earlier, before most Allied commanders had fully taken in the scale of what Germany had launched. Patton's Chief of Staff, Brigadier General Hobart Gay, together with Third Army's operations staff, had been watching the German breakthrough since its first hours on December 16th. Patton himself had seen almost immediately that the attack was far more significant than early reports made it sound, and that Third Army was going to have to turn north. The only question was when and how. Before he drove to Verdun, Patton had already quietly told his staff to draw up 3 separate plans for attacking north. Each one used a different mix of available divisions. Each took a different route. Each came with its own supply requirements and timeline. The code words were already set. The subordinate commanders had already been briefed. When Patton gave the word, one phone call, whichever plan Eisenhower approved could start moving immediately. Most Army commanders show up to a crisis conference with their read of the situation and a request for guidance. Patton showed up at Verdun with orders already written, units already briefed, and supply columns already starting to shift. During the conference itself, he made that phone call back to headquarters. By the time the Verdun meeting broke up, Third Army's machinery had already started to turn. The 48 hours he'd committed to wasn't the time he needed to plan. It was the time he needed to move. To understand why professional military planners looked at this and said it couldn't be done, or at best that it needed weeks, not days, you have to understand what moving a field army actually involves. The U.S. Third Army in December 1944 was made up of multiple corps, each with several divisions, each division around 15,000 men with their full weight of armor, artillery, engineers, signal units, and medical teams. Behind all of that was a supply system of enormous complexity: fuel dumps, ammunition stocks, supply convoys, repair facilities, forward medical stations, all of it carefully set up and running for an army that was moving east. Every gallon of fuel was sitting where it needed to be for an eastward push. Every ammunition stockpile was positioned for an eastward push. Every supply convoy was running on roads laid out for an eastward push. Now, in 48 hours, the Army would go north. That meant physically moving supply convoys onto completely different roads. It meant sorting out the road network across the entire Army, because if several divisions tried to use the same frozen Belgian lane at the same time, the traffic would lock the whole advance in place before it even got going. It meant shifting fuel dumps and ammunition stockpiles to spots that actually made sense for a northward move. It meant repositioning artillery, rebuilding communications networks, moving medical facilities. The standard planning timeline for this kind of job, done carefully with proper time built in for coordination at every level, was weeks. Not as a conservative guess, as a working reality. Because getting it wrong had serious consequences. Columns stacking up on iced roads, divisions running dry in the wrong place, communications going silent at the worst possible moment. Patton's logistics and operations staff got the essential work done in 2 days. They did it by working through the nights of December 19th and 20th, by putting military police at every major junction to sort out traffic on the fly, and by accepting a level of organized risk that normal planning timelines exist precisely to keep you away. 3 divisions formed the striking force heading north, with the 4th Armored Division out front. The 4th Armored was one of the most battle-hardened armored units the Americans had. Its record ran all the way back to Normandy. Its commanders knew how to keep moving under pressure, how to push through resistance without getting stuck, and how to stay in the fight when conditions were telling everyone to stop. They were going to need all of that, because the roads north were narrow Belgian country lanes, glazed over with compacted ice, never built for military convoys hauling tanks and artillery. Temperatures fell well below freezing at night. Engines needed long warm-up periods just to start reliably. Breakdowns were constant. And on either side of those roads, forested hills, frozen fields, ditches hidden under snow, there was almost no room to go around anything. Somewhere to the north, the clock on Bastogne was still ticking. The push north started in the hours before dawn on December 20th. For the men making that march, it was defined by cold, exhaustion, and the particular grind of needing to move fast, while everything around them fought back against the idea. Temperatures dropped well below freezing at night. Vehicles sat in long columns with engines running just to keep from seizing up, burning through fuel that was already stretched thin. When columns stopped, for a blocked road, for a vehicle sliding off an icy shoulder, for a bridge that needed engineers to check it before armor could cross, the men waited outside in the dark. No fires allowed. Military police stood at every major junction, keeping columns moving and separated so that convoys didn't pile into each other and turn the whole advance into a frozen traffic jam. Engineers moved out ahead of the armored columns, checking bridges, laying treadway where the road surface had broken up, clearing whatever the Germans had put in the way. Because the Germans were very much awake and paying attention. As the scale of what Third Army was doing became clear, German units moved fast to block it. Armor shifted to contest the main roads south of Bastogne. Artillery opened up on the American columns. Infantry dug in along the ridges and tree lines to slow the advance and force costly detours. Every mile north had a price. The 4th armored ground forward against resistance that got harder the closer it got to Bastogne. When the direct roads were too heavily held, combat commands swung wide, looking for gaps in the German blocking positions. Fights broke out at small Belgian villages that most people have never heard of, Bigonville, Chaumont, Warnac, where American armor and infantry went at German defenders in conditions brutal for everyone involved. This was not a clean, fast drive to a waiting rescue. It was a hard, grinding, costly, mile-by-mile fight against an enemy that knew exactly what the Americans were trying to do, and was doing everything it could to make sure they failed. Inside Bastogne, the men held on. On December 23rd, the weather broke just enough. Allied transport aircraft finally got through and dropped supplies into the perimeter: ammunition, medical supplies, food. Not enough to fix the situation, but enough to buy time. Fighter bombers got airborne and hit German positions around the perimeter and along the supply lines, keeping the encircling forces fed. The gap was closing from both ends. By December 25th, the forward elements of the 4th Armored had fought their way to within a few miles of Bastogne's southern edge. Between them and the men inside was one last line of German defensive positions. And those positions were not going to move without a real fight. By the evening of December 25th, Combat Command Reserve of the 4th Armored Division had fought its way to within a few miles of Bastogne's southern edge. The German defensive line holding the southern approaches was dug in and serious. German infantry, backed by anti-tank guns and artillery, held the ridges and villages sitting between the American spearhead and the men inside the perimeter. A straight drive north would push American armor straight into the strongest ground the Germans had. Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, a man who would later become one of the most important figures in American military history, was tasked with finding a way through. Abrams worked the ground, looking for a route that skirted the most heavily defended positions. Through the night of December 25th and into the early hours of December 26th, His battalion worked its way toward the small village of Eisenhower, a spot that looked like it might offer a crack in the German line. On the afternoon of December 26th, Abrams sent his battalion straight through Eisenhower. Artillery came down on the village as the tanks rolled, hitting the defenders and keeping their heads down. The attack was fast, aggressive, willing to take real risk, because by this point the alternative to taking risk was not making it at all. The tanks got through. At around 4:50 in the afternoon on December 26, 1944, the lead Sherman tanks of the 37th Tank Battalion reached the southern edge of Bastogne's perimeter and made contact with the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion of the 101st Airborne Division. The encirclement was broken. The corridor was narrow, barely enough room to push vehicles through, and German forces on either side of it were still right there. The fighting around Bastogne would go on for weeks. Nobody inside the town that evening believed the hard part was over. But the ring was open. Supplies could come in, casualties could go out. The German plan, isolate Bastogne, starve it, wait for it to fall, had been overtaken. It had failed. The relief of Bastogne on December 26th did not end the Battle of the Bulge. Heavy fighting went on across the Ardennes well into January 1945. German forces tried repeatedly to cut the relief corridor and put the ring back around Bastogne. None of it worked. As January wore on, the basic reality that had always threatened the Ardennes offensive came down hard. German fuel reserves, already barely sufficient when the offensive kicked off, were now gone beyond any real hope of recovery. Armored formations that had pushed deep into Allied territory no longer had the fuel to keep fighting forward, and in some cases struggled even to pull back cleanly. Ammunition was rationed at every level. Fresh soldiers were pulled from pools Germany had no way to refill. The weather cleared enough for Allied air power to return in force. Supply convoys on German roads were hit repeatedly. Bridges were bombed. Moving anything in daylight across a widening stretch of front became genuinely dangerous. The Allied line, which had buckled hard when the German offensive hit, steadied and then began pushing back. By late January, German forces were pulling back across most of the Ardennes, roughly where they had started, but having burned through reserves, Germany simply could not afford to lose. German losses in the Battle of the Bulge ran to more than 60,000 killed, wounded, and captured. Equipment losses were deep and irreplaceable. Germany's last serious offensive reserve in the West was gone. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's final attempt to change the course of the war in the West, had come apart. American forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945. Soviet forces reached Berlin in late April. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. No single battle ends a war, but the relief of Bastogne marked the point where Germany's last genuine chance in the West closed for good. They said it was impossible, not because they were wrong about how hard it was. The weather was exactly as brutal as the planners said. The roads were exactly as bad as the calculations suggested. The challenge of swinging a field army 90 degrees, repositioning its entire supply system, and launching a major attack on a new heading in under 48 hours had genuinely not been done before in the American experience of that war. They weren't wrong about any of that. They were wrong about what Patton had already done before they finished laying out the problem. The contingency plans that existed before the Verdun Conference meant that when Eisenhower asked who could attack and how soon, Patton wasn't figuring out how long it might take to plan. He was telling them how long it would take to move. That gap between a headquarters that responds to crises and one that anticipates them is what set his answer apart. The march north was full of the things that always slow armies down: traffic, breakdowns, German blocking positions, supply strain, weather that kept shifting. The final push to Bastogne was not polished. It was a hard fight through stubborn resistance by men who had been going continuously for days. What made it work wasn't that the obstacles turned out to be smaller than expected. It was that Patton decided they could be beaten before anyone else had finished deciding they couldn't, and had the machine running before anyone asked him to start it. One decision made before it was requested changed the course of the entire campaign. The relief of Bastogne did not win the war. No single action does, but it shut the only real door through which Germany's last offensive in the West might have succeeded. It showed, clearly and decisively, that the initiative had passed to Allied hands for good, and it did so under conditions the best professional judgment of the day had called impossible. The title of this story is not a boast. It is a historical fact. In December 1944, experienced Allied planners looked at what would be required to reach Bastogne in time and concluded it could not be done on any timeline that mattered. They were right about the conditions. They were right about what the job demanded. What they had not accounted for was a commander who had already worked out the answer before the question was formally asked, who had already set the planning in motion before the crisis reached its peak, and who understood that the men inside Bastogne could not wait for a plan built around caution. On the afternoon of December 26, 1944, when the first American tanks reached the southern edge of Bastogne and made contact with the 101st Airborne, what the planning staff had said could not happen had already happened. They said it was impossible. He did it anyway. The war in Europe would continue for another 4 months. But at a frozen crossroads town in Belgium on the afternoon of December 26th, its ending had already begun. If this was worth your time today, please subscribe. Every week we go deep into the military decisions, leadership moments, and turning points that shape the world we live in now. Next time, we follow Third Army beyond Bastogne, as the rescue turned into pursuit and the drive began that would carry American forces to the Rhine. The relief of Bastogne was the beginning of the end. What came after it was the end itself. I'll see you then.